Good afternoon. I am incredibly honored to be here today with you all in a space such as the Barrett Suite, where genuine conversation and innovative thought are not only encouraged and cultivated, but safeguarded. This unique event is truly invaluable to students such as myself who care for and about the humanities and aspire to the kind of interdisciplinary work that Ms. Sturgess and Mr. Irvin have and continue to epitomize in their academic careers. Although as an out-of-state college student, I have certainly experienced the bittersweet sentiment which often accompanies homecoming. The one for which we have gathered here today is entirely joyous. We come together to celebrate the accomplishments of two fellow scholars and to partake in a discourse about those things we Hermeneutics hold most dear: philosophy, conversation, and community. Currently a doctoral candidate at Purdue University studying philosophy and communication, Ms. Jessica Sturgess embodies everything Barrett students strive to be and is a true representative of what it means to be a Barrett alumna. Ms. Sturgess graduated summa cum laude from ASU and Barrett the Honors College in 2007, majoring in communication studies with a minor in philosophy. While a Barrett student, she completed her thesis, Now Suppose They Could Speak, or Turning Toward Testimony's Revolutionary Potential, an investigation in the philosophy of communication. A truly impressive undergraduate body of work, and those who have read it in its entirety are faced with no less than 112, yes, 112 pages. Ms. Sturgess then went on to receive her master's in communication from the University of Pittsburgh before being awarded the Ross Fellowship at Purdue University to pursue her doctoral degree. Ms. Sturgess has published a journal article entitled The Strange Leisure of the Snake-Bitten, Listening to the Wonder of Socrates with Dr. Ramsey, has written no less than 12 pieces for varying conferences and panels, one of which was chosen as the top student paper in the philosophy of communication, and was one of only 5 Purdue students chosen to participate in the French-American Cultural Exchange Seminar at the University of Paris. Myself and every other Barrett student hoping to follow in Ms. Sturgess's footsteps has heard of or experienced firsthand her impactful legacy while a part of this honors community, and it is quite clear that she is one tough act to follow. It is my immense privilege to introduce her here today. The title of Ms. Sturgess's lecture is Taking a Hint, Coming Home to the Art of Communication. Please join me in welcoming to the podium Ms. Jessica Sturgess.
That would be the best introduction I will ever have in my entire life. Just give me 1 second. Struggle to open that. Okay.
I could have opened it for you, but
That's
I wanted
okay.
you to have a moment.
All right. Allow me to begin by saying how grateful I am to be speaking here today. I must admit this is something I had been dreaming of since I graduated from Barrett in 2007, and I'm entirely overwhelmed that it has become a reality. So many thanks to each of you, faculty, staff, and students alike, who have made this possible. The theme of this lecture is hermeneutics and homecoming. This is the case, I suspect, because those of us speaking throughout the series have cultivated a sort of hermeneutic sensitivity to the world, and we find ourselves at home, or returning home, as the case might be for myself, within the philosophical space of the college. But this thematic pairing of hermeneutics and homecoming goes much deeper, I believe, and it is to their more fundamental relationship that I shall speak today. My talk consists of 3 parts, each inspired by an epigraph, and these parts weave between issues of hermeneutics and homecoming until they become, I am hopeful, indistinguishable. So, part 1, a thought incompressible. And it begins with an epigraph from the poet John Keats. It's a letter to his friend John Hamilton Reynolds, where Keats says, "My dear Reynolds, I have an idea that a man or a woman might pass a very pleasant life in this manner. To let him on any certain day read a certain page full of poetry or distilled prose, and let him wander with it and muse upon it and reflect from it and bring home to it and prophesy upon it and dream upon it until it becomes stale. But when will it do so? Never." So we'll start with that. Philosophy, as the ancients taught us time and again, begins in wonder. An object of wonder rattles and provokes us. The wonder may have been brought on perhaps by witnessing a passing comet, the intricacies of a molecule, the majesty of a natural landscape, or an artwork. Regardless of its originating source, wonder stirs something in us, excites us, and I believe moves us to speak. For the ancient philosophers, and many others, the greatest wonder was provoked by the totality of existence, namely the question, why is there something rather than nothing? In other words, the greatest wonder was the question of being. This wonder was not the wonder that brought me to philosophy. Instead, the object or the impetus of my own wonder was a variation on this theme. Why do we say something rather than nothing? That is, I've always been moved by the fact that we speak. The wonder of being and the wonder of language have long been of a pair, and in understanding this relationship, I suspect we can get a better grasp on the relationship between hermeneutics and homecoming. So getting back to Keats' suggestion that we might have a pleasant time, and maybe even learn something too, where we meditate on a passage, I wish to think for a while on a short statement that draws together these two wonders. To be sure, one of the greatest philosophical lessons of hermeneutics is the conviction that texts of a certain kind are inexhaustible. So I want to forefront now that my reading of this text is only one among many possible others. But before running ahead, let me give just a bit of context. In 1947, in response to inquiries regarding his relationship with humanism and existentialism, Martin Heidegger penned his Letter on Humanism. Although many have claimed the Letter on Humanism as Heidegger's most provocative work, I personally find it the most challenging and difficult to comprehend. It has continually baffled me since I read it here several years ago, so in some ways my talk today is simply an effort to come to terms with my profound confusion for this essay. In terms of the history of philosophy, Heidegger's letter turned to publication can be read as a response to Jean-Paul Sartre's essay, Existentialism as a Humanism, wherein Sartre sets forth the fundamental tenet of existentialism, that existence precedes essence. We can understand Sartre's claim that existence precedes essence as the assertion that there is no fundamental human nature, whether biologically or theologically determined, that undergirds our existence, but rather, human beings are an open and ongoing project wherein we must determine ourselves. We must act because we are free, and we are free because we can act. Furthermore, for Sartre, this reversal of the dominant metaphysical presupposition that there is an underlying human nature forms a kind of humanism, because it finally, from Sartre's perspective, exalts the dignity of human beings as those who are fundamentally free. So that's Sartre. Heidegger confounds this position and begins his letter by raising the question of the meaning of action. Action has predominantly been philosophically understood through the lens of causality. That is, human beings are acting agents when they have the power to cause an effect. Furthermore, we evaluate action in terms of utility, namely how an action can achieve a particular end or purpose. The problem with this understanding for Heidegger is that it is far too quick and cursory and quite caught up in the instrumentalization of thought. Indeed, this seems to be the problem Heidegger encounters again and again and again, wherever he turns, which reminds me of Bergson's claim that a philosopher worthy of any name, not any name, worthy of the name, being a philosopher, has never said more than a single thing, and even then it is something that he or she has tried to say rather than actually said. That aside, Heidegger seeks to deepen the understanding of action so as to deepen the understanding of human being, and thus move beyond humanism to something deeper still. He does so by turning to what is often thought to be the counterpart or the opposite of action, thinking. For Heidegger, thinking is not subservient to acting. It is not something that we do so that we might then act, but thinking is action in its most illustrious form, and it has the most intimate connection with truth. Heidegger writes, quote, "Thinking accomplishes the relation of being to the essence of man," end quote. In other words, it is through thinking that the most profound of the profound, that is being itself, is brought into a relationship with human beings. Thinking for Heidegger is always the thinking of being, as it both belongs to being and listens to it. Indeed, of what else than being could we ever truly think? So now that I've explicated only the first half of the first paragraph of the essay, we reach the sentence that I wish to focus on for the remainder of the talk. And I will not go any further, really, in the essay beyond this one sentence. Heidegger states, "Language is the house of being." How are we to understand such a sentence? Part 2. Learning how to read. And Emerson helps us with this one in a letter to Thomas Carlyle. Emerson writes to his very close friend at the time, "Here I sit and read and write with very little system, and as far as regards composition, with the most fragmentary result. Paragraphs incompressible, each sentence an infinitely repellent particle." I think it's great. In his essay, The Aphorism, Fragments from the Breakdown of Reason, Gary Saul Morson draws a distinction between riddles, dictums, and aphorisms. Although each share a similar form, namely that they're abbreviated and shortened expressions, the three put their use of language to different ends and cultivate in the reader different expectations. To be sure, Heidegger's sentence, "Language is the house of being," is not a standalone fragment. It occurs in the context of a much longer essay. However, this line certainly takes on a character of its own in interpretations of Heidegger's work and in 20th century continental philosophy more generally. It is with this in mind that I believe we can treat his statement as an artifact of abbreviated form. Furthermore, although not a fragment proper, it is fragmentary in the sense Emerson describes. It is incompressible and repellent, as it generates deeper and greater interpretations with each reading. Morson's typology of the riddle, the dictum, and the aphorism gives us, I believe, a kind of reading protocol from which we can orient ourselves to understand this text. The riddle. The riddle is then, although productive of multiple interpretations, it always has an answer. And this condition of having an answer recursively shapes the form of a riddle. Take, for example, the Sphinx's riddle to Oedipus. The riddle is this: what is the thing whose voice is one and whose feet are 4 and 2 and 3? The answer is, of course, human beings as they live out their finitude. First we crawl on all fours, then walk upright on 2, and finally utilize a cane, 3. Along the way to solving the riddle, we are open to a multitude of insights and readings. But at the end of the day, the riddle has a single answer. As Morson puts it, if life were a riddle, everything could be solved. Life's not a riddle, I assure you. The dictum, lacking in all mystery, resembles an answer to a riddle. The dictum reduces complexity to a simple statement. For example, Marx's claim in the Communist Manifesto that the history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles. And I heard some of you just learned that today. Okay. What we do with the dictum is no doubt complex and laced with conflicts of interpretation, but the dictum itself is transparent. There's little confusion over what the author meant or how the statement is to be understood. Moreover, for Morson, dicta have totalizing tendencies that prohibit exceptions. They aim, in covering everything, to be both clear and certain, avoiding doubt and complexity when possible. Contrary to both the riddle and the dictum, the aphorism values above all the preservation of mystery. Morson writes, quote, "Despite their variety in tone, form, and language, aphorisms all share a sense of what is most valuable, that what is most valuable to grasp lies beyond our reach." In other words, the aphorism always points beyond itself, beyond the world of the text, and into the to and fro of our own existence. The truth of an aphorism is obscure. It raises entanglements rather than clarifies, and it perplexes us rather than soothes. Like Morson, the opening lines of the Tao Te Ching come to mind when searching for examples. It reads, quote, "The way that can be spoken of is not the constant way. The name that can be named is not the constant name. Mystery upon mystery, the gateway of manifold secrets." This aphorism opens us out upon a world imbued with mystery, into a world about which it is difficult to speak. So, language is the house of being. Is it a riddle? Is it a dictum or an aphorism? The sentence asks no question, though it demands we ask questions of it. There's no trick to solving it, no answer that it calls forward with a bit of hermeneutic finesse. There's little textual evidence that we are to read it as a riddle, and I question what would be gained by such an interpretation. Perhaps, though it is a dictum, the statement is clear. Indeed, it might be the most understandable sentence in the essay if we try only to understand each word's denotation. In this sense, I'm glad someone else thinks this is complex. and the avoidance of conflicts of interpretation. However, as soon as we go beyond denotation, I find it, astonishingly perplexing. Furthermore, for Morrison, dictums take on an axiomatic quality. That is, they serve as the foundation for future action. Heidegger's statement, and his work generally, never tells us what to do. Let us then read it as an aphorism, and open ourselves to the mystery this statement holds. Our preliminary understanding is at best dim, and we risk slipping into error. So let us begin with what I think is the easier question first, or at first. What is language? Heidegger clarifies. That was for you. Heidegger clarifies later in the essay, quote, language is not the utterance of an organism, nor is it the expression of a living thing. Never can it ever be thought in an essentially correct way in terms of its symbolic character, perhaps not even in terms of the character of signification. Language is the clearing, concealing advent of being itself. End quote. By language, Heidegger does not and never has meant only those who work with words, whether written or spoken, though this certainly is part of language. Language is greater than this. It is the way in which we make meaning of being. Or said differently, language is the space wherein meaning makes its entry into the world. I think we can safely turn to Gadamer on this issue when he writes, famously, being that can be understood is language. That is, being, or existence, which is disclosed to us understandably, is language. This is why the scope of language must be broadened not only to include words, but equally gesture, movement, and artistic marks. Each of these sites open up sites of further meaning. The more difficult question, I believe, is asking ourselves, what is a house? Robert Pogue Harrison, in his book, The Dominion of the Dead, devotes an entire chapter to this question. Like myself, Harrison turns not to architects or city planners to address this issue, but to poets and philosophers, and in his case, Thoreau and Rilke. Although the architect and the planner know how to build a home, it is the poet and the philosopher who asks what it means to dwell in one. So let us think phenomenologically for a moment about houses. What do houses do? And what does a house provide? A house foremost provides an enclosure or a shelter. As Harrison notes, the first are grave. We made a lasting place for others before we turned to a permanence for ourselves. Furthermore, within ancient Greek and Roman houses, there was often an altar upon which the sacred fires of ancestors burnt, which later became the ground for our understanding of a hearth. We might recall Heraclitus warming himself at his stove, telling visitors that, quote, even here too the gods are present. A house, then, bridges the living with the dead. Within the walls of a house or a home, we are also protected from the elements, and we are able to retain our vital heat. We are sheltered, at least momentarily, from the weather, from that which lies beyond our control. Furthermore, houses form a border, where inside and outside meet at its walls, and where one stands before a frontier. Within houses, we put things in their place, but houses too are a place of their own, a place where we put ourselves. They provide us with an orientation. Houses are an enclosure with an opening. The opening, of course, is key, as it prevents the house from becoming a prison. Deeper, though, a house places us at the opening, extending beyond ourselves, and orients us to the outside, and to a world always in excess of ourselves. But let us not forget, too, that houses can be haunted. That is to say, that which is present in a house need not correspond to the number of living inhabitants. Houses are filled with the memories of those no longer with us, as well as the expectation of those who have yet to arrive. Most pressingly, and returning to Heidegger, a house is that within which we dwell. So let us hear again Heidegger's aphorism. Language is the house of being. Language gives us a lasting place wherein we can dwell, wherein we can make meaning of this human situation caught between life and death, between the mundane and the cosmic. Language bridges time and culture and grants us the ability to oscillate between these poles. Harrison writes eloquently on this matter, quote, works of literature, then, are more than enduring tablets where an author's words survive his or her demise. They are the gifts of human worlds, cosmic in nature, that hold their place in time so that the living and the unborn may inhabit them at will, make themselves at home in the articulate humanity there. All thanks to the ultimate gift of the earth, which renders their testaments possible. Language, as the sedimentation of voices past, is haunted most of all. All speaking is a communing with ghosts, as it is their words we must say anew and make our own. But more importantly, however, language is what brings us to an opening, a precipice before ourselves wherein we cultivate our world with other people. Language, as our opening upon the world, to cite our teacher shared in common, potentializes the potential. Part 3, a time for homecoming. And my epigraph for this went a little astray, so it's from the Talking Heads, which is a band that you should listen to. So the lyric is, "Home is where I want to be, but I guess I'm already there." Heidegger follows, language is the house of being, with, quote, "In its home, man dwells. Those who think and those who create with words are guardians of this home. Their guardianship accomplishes the manifestation of being, insofar as they bring the manifestation to language and maintain it in language through their speech." In other words, language is both the house of being and the home of human beings. Human beings, language, and being itself are all entwined. To misunderstand one of these is, I fear, to misunderstand all three. Indeed, this is Heidegger's greatest concern, that hitherto all of this has been poorly understood. We might think of it this way. The greatest problem we face today is the problem of homelessness. Heidegger takes up this issue in his essay Building Dwelling Thinking. By homelessness, though, he did not mean those who lack sufficient shelter, and we could do well to see this as a political fault. Nevertheless, his claim has significant ontological importance, which undergirds the very real ontic problem of a housing crisis. We live in homelessness because we fundamentally misunderstand that language is the house of being, the house within which we also dwell. Heidegger writes, quote, "To be sure, there rages round the earth an unbridled, yet clever talking, writing, and broadcasting of spoken words. Man acts as though he were the shaper and master of language, while in fact language remains the master of man. Perhaps it is, before all else, man's subversion of this relation of dominance that drives his nature into alienation. That we retain a concern for care in speaking is all to the good, but it is of no help to us as long as language still serves us, even then only as a means of expression. Among all the appeals that we human beings, on our part, can help to be voiced, language is the highest and everywhere the first." In a sense, we have brought this homelessness upon ourselves by treating language not as the site through which meaning is disclosed within the world, nor as the space between life and death wherein we dwell as mortals, but as a mere tool in the instrumentalization of thought, as a medium through which information is transferred, or at best, as a means of expressing the thoughts in our heads. But philosophical hermeneutics has been quite clear on this issue. Language is neither the transference of information nor the expression of thought. It is the clearing, concealing advent of being itself. It is the dialectical interplay of question and response within textuality. It is the disclosure of truth and meaning to finite human understanding. At this point, however, our reading of Heidegger's aphorism breaks down, or at least it breaks down our ordinary expectations for sense-making. Thus, we must look at the mystery this fragment points to. Indeed, if Morrison is right, that language always points beyond itself, but we nevertheless remain entangled within it, then we must give voice to what language is telling us. Morrison states, quote, "The aphorism senses its senselessness. The aphorism cannot be read like a dictum. What it wants to find isn't in it, but beyond it. It neither says nor conceals, but gives a sign. The sign, when contemplated, leads not to a final statement, then it would be a riddle, but to another sign. Each step takes us a bit further, but we see that it is not in the sign itself that meaning lies, though we need the sign to intimate meanings. In this case, the senselessness is that we are not homeless, as there is no escaping the disclosive nature of language. This is perhaps our greatest hope. For as much as we use language, that is, for as much as we put it to ends of efficiency and expediency and calculation, we nevertheless are dwelling within it. It is a home within which we continuously remain and find ourselves already there. It is our sheet anchor against the technologization of being. We are rather profoundly house poor. We live in shambles. Our rooms are in tatters. It's a paltry shelter in the world. The homes within which we live are not the homes we need or even deserve. To be sure, there is no living outside of language, but it is equally true that the manifestations of language within which we live could be otherwise. Certainly, we have examples of the disclosure of meaning that resist technologization. One need only think of his or her favorite painting or poem to see that we have alternatives at hand. Indeed, we have a whole tradition and heritage of alternatives. As I draw this exploration to a close, I am reminded of a poem that I read and learned here many years ago, but one that has never left me. And it strikes me that it speaks to this question of homelessness. So Bertolt Brecht, that great radical playwright and poet of wartime Germany, so if you're already going to listen to Talking Heads, go ahead and read some text, wrote a poem entitled The Buddha's Parable of the Burning House. So it's about a house. Therein he recounts the Buddha's response, not to those who asked the question, but to those patient enough to listen, of what nothingness might feel like. So allow me to quote the end of the poem at kind of great length. This is the Buddha talking. Lately I saw a house. It was burning. The flame licked at its roof. I went up close and observed that there were people still inside. I entered the doorway and called out to them that the roof was ablaze, so exhorting them to leave at once. But those people seemed in no hurry. One of them, while the heat was already scorching his eyebrows, asked me what it was like outside, whether there was another house for them, and more of this kind. Without answering, I went out again. These people here, I thought, must burn to death before they stop asking questions. And truly, friends, whoever does not yet feel such heat in the floor that he'll gladly exchange it for any other, rather than stay, to that man I have nothing to say. So said the Buddha. And this is the poet's response. But we too, no longer concerned with the art of submission, rather with that of non-submission, and offering various proposals of an earthly nature, and beseeching men to shake off their human tormentors, we too believe that to those who in the face of this rising bomber squadrons of capital go on asking too long how we propose to do this, and how we envisage that, and what will become of their savings and their Sunday trousers after revolution, we have nothing much to say. Stand and go. This silence says more than we might think, and it is the silence that an aphorism demands. Morse reminds us that through the aphorism, quote, we reach an understanding, but it is one that cannot be put into words, even if words have been part of the process by which we read it. We sense it as a different kind of silence. We are left then with hints and the cultivation of a hermeneutic sensitivity that gives us the orientation from which to read them off the world.